Hey there, everyone. Thank you for listening to Honest Defense. I wanted to give a little introduction to this episode because Professor Lessig and I really got deep into who Aaron Swartz was and his legacy, and the discussion got very intense. So I wanted to just give you an overview of who Aaron was so that you could maybe follow the conversation a little bit better. Aaron was a boy genius. I mean, from the age of 13, 14, he was very deeply involved in some of the major developments of the internet. He helped put together RSS, which, if you're listening to this through a podcasting app, you're doing it because of RSS. He was deeply involved in the early days of Wikipedia. He was a co-founder of Reddit. And he also thought very deeply about a lot of things, about problems with the world and how to fix them. And he very much believed in the idea of the free exchange of information and ideas, and that if we wanted to get to the truth, we had to get as much information out there to as many people as possible and debate these ideas, debate these facts. And he ultimately lost his life because he believed in those ideals. We get into this in the podcast. He ran into a lot of issues with the law in pursuit of these beliefs, first with the PACER system and then with JSTOR. The PACER system is, we talk about, it's a government system that stores federal cases online behind a paywall. So if you want to access these cases, you have to pay for them. And Aaron believed that this is the law that governs people. They should have free access to it. They shouldn't have to pay to see the law that they live under. And those charges were ultimately dropped, the charges against him, when he got caught for downloading cases off of PACER. But then he did something similar with JSTOR, which is a database of academic journals and academic articles. He, again, hacked into the system, downloaded a bunch of articles, and got caught. And the federal government threw the hammer at him, and he was facing some serious charges because of what he did. And he took his own life in the middle of this. And Professor Lessig was a mentor of Aaron's. He was very close to Aaron. You can see he gets very emotional when we're talking about this stuff. And Aaron's story is a story that needs to be told. He was such a bright light in the world of technology, in the world of politics. His politics weren't my politics, but I always respected him. I knew about Aaron pretty early on, and I always respected him because he believed in the value of debate and in looking for the truth. And again, I always respected that about him, and his loss was a huge loss to everyone. So I'm so grateful that Professor Lessig took the time to talk with me about this. He's one of the foremost legal academics in the country. So it was incredible to get to talk to him about Aaron. If you want to find out more about Aaron, if you want to learn more about his story, I mentioned the book in the podcast. There's a book called The Boy Who Could Change the World. It's a collection of Aaron's blog posts, and you can actually still access the blog posts online for free on Aaron's website. It's aaronsw.com. There was a documentary made called The Internet's Own Boy. You can see that anywhere you watch movies online. And without further ado, here's Professor Lawrence Lessig. All right, everyone, thank you for tuning into Honest Defense. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Lawrence Lessig. Professor Lessig is the Roy L. Furman Professor of Law and Leadership at Harvard Law School. As a young lawyer, he clerked for Richard Posner and Justice Scalia. He has written a number of books, most recently, They Don't Represent Us, Reclaiming Our Democracy, which came out last year. He also hosts the weekly podcast Another Way, where he discusses how to fix corruption in government. The New Yorker has called him the most important thinker on intellectual property in the internet era. And it was through his work on technology and copyright that he met Aaron Swartz. Professor Lessig was a mentor to Aaron, who would have turned 34 next month. And it is Aaron's life and legacy that we're here to talk about today. Professor Lessig, thank you so much for joining me.
I'm glad to be here.
So I wanted to start by asking you about one of Aaron's blog posts. Aaron was an avid blogger. He wrote about, and you can actually still see his blog post on his personal website, and he wrote about every topic under the sun, and so many of his posts were just beautifully written and well meticulously researched. But my favorite blog post was actually a very brief one that he wrote when he was at Stanford. And the first time I read it years ago, it made me laugh and it made me fall in love with Aaron. And the post was about how, I'll summarize it. He was eating breakfast one day while he was at Stanford, and must have been somewhere out in public in the school cafeteria or something like that. And a few female friends of his who they'd been there sitting there before him, and he had walked in and sat at a different table and started reading. And those two friends came up to him and they said to him, it's rude to show up and to not sit with your friends when you see them eating somewhere else. And he said, well, I'm sure that the conversation with you would have been interesting, but this book is filled with expert ideas and novel opinions. And they said, well, it's really just it's atypical to not feel like that you need to talk with other people. And he said, maybe I'm not the one who's atypical. He said, I'm perfectly happy talking with other people when I want to talk with other people, and you're the one who's not happy just sitting and being by yourself at any time. And when you hear that story, if you don't understand how the mind of someone like Aaron works, it sounds like he's being a jerk. But to me, it was so beautiful. It was a beautiful representation of how his unique way of thinking was, this kind of hyper rationality. And so you knew Aaron personally, and I was just wondering if that story kind of to you exemplifies the Aaron that you knew.
I mean, in ways it does. The striking thing about Aaron from his very, very early on was that he wouldn't accept the way the world wanted him to conform. So he didn't like school, and he created a different kind of educational experience. He went to Stanford. He didn't like that, so he dropped out of Stanford. Basically, whenever things didn't fit, he didn't think it was his job to conform to it. He thought it was his job to figure out how to make it fit to what he wanted, or to change the context. And that takes with anybody obviously a lot of strength, a personal strength, which was obviously something that defined him in everything he did.
And so you met Aaron when you were both attending conferences on technology and copyright, and you met him, I believe he was an early teenager, 13, 14. Do you remember when you first met him and what your first impression of him was?
I have an impression of meeting him. I don't have any sense of when it was, but I remember it was like a conference and he was actually there with one of his parents, and he was a kid sitting in the front, and he came up and he asked me a bunch of smart questions, and then after that somebody connected me back to that memory when he was being recommended as the person who would set up the technical infrastructure for Creative Commons. So we'd begun a connection then, but it was really only after we pulled him into Creative Commons that I became really close to understanding what he thought or what he believed.
Was there something something unique about him? Because I'm sure you've spent your career around very bright people. You went to law school at Yale. You've taught at Stanford and Harvard. Was there something about Aaron that stuck out to you as particularly exemplary? Maybe it's just the fact that he was so young and he was thinking these thoughts.
I think that there's a way we all want to be, and that is we want to do what we believe is right. And especially when you get to be 100 years old, as I am now.
You look good for 100.
Yeah, well, I work hard at it. You can think back on all the times where you knew what was the right thing to do, but you didn't have the courage to do it. And I think what was clear from getting to know Aaron early on is that whenever he felt that, he worked as hard as he could to just do what he thought the right thing was, and to learn not to worry about the consequences from it. Just do the right thing. Now, his conception of the right thing is not necessarily the world's conception of the right thing. So, for example, the event which eventually unraveled his life was triggered by, doing something which the law said was not the right thing. He had his own conception of right and wrong. But the point is not that his conception is correct or not. It's that he had the courage to act on what he thought was right. And he could really shame others into that same sort of behavior. I've told the story often about him sort of triggering me to change dramatically the direction of my career. And part of what that was me recognizing him as the sort of person who, once he recognized what was right, he would just do it. And thinking, why am I not that person? Like, if I recognize this is what's right, why don't I just do it? And then I did, so this was me trying to be that person. And I think that's a distinctive person, because I think most people quickly learn that the safer, better, happier way is to conform, just to fit within what, not necessarily right, but what's comfortable or easy or expected or appropriate. And that is a happier life for many people, and if you can accept that kind of life, then it's probably happier for you. I often wonder, he obviously wasn't my child, and I have 3 children. I often wonder, which do I want my children to be? Do I want them to be like Aaron, just always, rigidly doing what he believes is right? Or do I want them to, conform more or fit in more or worry a little bit more about whether this path takes them to a path of happiness? It's a hard question for a parent to ask. But it was clear what the answer to that question was for him.
Yeah. It seems like he did struggle at times. Like he tried to fit into kind of normal society. I mean, he went to Stanford. I wanted to ask you about that because he went to Stanford for a year and dropped out. But his decision to even attend Stanford at all, he wrote a lot about the problems with schooling and kind of modern education. So I was wondering, and I think you actually were teaching at Stanford at the time. So I wonder if you actually even played a role in him deciding to go to Stanford, and why did he want to go there?
I don't remember a conversation about him coming to Stanford. I mean, but obviously I was happy he was coming, and he was excited to be in Silicon Valley, and lots of really cool things were going on. I do remember, to the extent I wanted to play a advisory role, or a role as his advisor, I do remember telling him, like, there were things to learn in the world. You couldn't just take a shallow understanding of certain fields and believe you understood it. And the most important for me was his having a deeper understanding of economics than he did. He had a very, I thought he had a very shallowish kind of, kind of crude progressive understanding of like the evils of the market. And that's not to deny there aren't evils and flaws in the market, but I think that there's, having studied economics for many years myself, I thought that there was a lot to understand there that he wasn't getting. So I said to him, I really thought he needed, to discipline himself with formal education. Now, whether you could do that at Stanford or do that anywhere, given who he was a question I couldn't answer. But I thought it was important for him to try that.
And were you disappointed when he dropped out after a year?
No, I was never disappointed. Because I could understand. It's not like he, it was an easy decision. It's not like or an ill-informed decision. I mean, I feel like he, was in it enough to understand what he would get out of it and ask whether he thought, he needed to get that. And, he decided he didn't need it.
Right. And then from there, I think that's when he started his own company, Infogami, I think it was called. And they ended up being bought out by Reddit just a few months after Reddit had started. And so it seemed like, again, he kind of maybe had this idea that, I'll get into Silicon Valley, and that's where people are thinking about these big ideas and doing big things. And then Reddit shortly got bought out by Condé Nast, a big corporation. And it seemed like he was really frustrated with working for a big company and that typical office life. Did he talk to you at all about those frustrations about having to work in an office and feeling kind of constrained there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing to recognize is that Aaron originally kind of has this silver bullet conception of technology. So like, if we can just make information accessible and freely accessible, then we can fix everything. And so that's the early RSS work and the early, let's make, he had a platform to make it so anybody could build web pages. I mean, it was all about making it easy for people to connect and share information. And as he moved through that activism, he began to recognize that there were more fundamental issues that also had to be addressed, and they weren't going to be just fixed by clever coding. It was going to require changes in law and the like. And so I think that he was intrigued to help the guys who were starting Reddit solve a problem they had about how they would architect Reddit. And I'm pleased that it turned out to be economically successful, although I'm sure they all regretted their early exit because it turned out to be wildly underpriced for
Right.
what it has become. Um, but I think that he was never doing it because he wanted to be a rich guy, or never doing it because he wanted to become the next Mark Zuckerberg. He was doing it because he thought it actually would enable a different kind of access to knowledge. I remember we had a conversation about it, and there was a real question about whether it would be good or bad to have this Reddit form as a kind of platform of knowledge. But he was promoting it not because it was going to be the next hot thing. He was promoting it because he thought it would be the next good thing. And then once it was bought out and he saw that there are other interests that would be driving how it was developed, Condé Nast interests, that led him to say, this is just not where my work should be now. So, he pretty self-consciously behaved in a way that would lead him to be fired, because he wasn't free to walk away, but he was free to get fired. So he showed up late, he didn't do his work, he, did whatever it took to get fired, and then he got fired. And, it was like Jamie Farr on MASH. He was trying to get qualified to be ejected, and then he was. And so then he was free to go on and do the other things he wanted to do.
Yeah. I wonder what Aaron would. I don't want to ask you what he would have thought, because I don't think that's a fair question. But I guess from your perspective, the state of online communication now, of social media, how do you think that comports with Aaron's vision of what he wanted platforms like Reddit to be, and just general online communication?
I think the thing that none of us at the beginning were really focused on enough was how the business model of advertising would change the world. So in the beginning, the idea was, let's just open up the channels and remove the so-called censors. And once we did that, then the best stuff could rise to the top. And obviously, the business model of advertising has radically changed that assumption. And the surveillance capitalism that it has driven, as Shoshana Zuboff puts in her really extraordinary book of the same name, it's produced an ecosystem of information which feeds off of understanding us as deeply as it can, and not passively. I mean, the point is, it would be one thing if, like somebody sitting in a corner counting the number of VWs who drive by, that's one kind of data collection. But this is data collection where they're like poking us or riling us up or making us angry or making us feel lonely or making us happy. Like they're playing with all of our emotions so that we reveal more, right? Like Facebook is a machine designed to make you insecure. That's its purpose, right? Because the more insecure it makes you, the more you want to share. And the more you share, the more the more the AI understands about what you would want, and the more it knows how to advertise to you. That's an extraordinary idea that I don't think anybody, certainly I never had that conversation with Aaron, was thinking about as we began to fight for this sort of, as we were fighting for the infrastructure of freedom that the internet was. And I think that, he would have, he was very famous for framing understandings of technology in an appropriately sophisticated way. So it's one of his last interviews, on television, he's talking about, the Janus face of technology. The internet's both the best of all possible worlds and the worst of all possible worlds, right?
Right.
It's both together at the same time. And this kind of data surveillance or surveillance capitalism part, I think he would recognize is the most poisonous feature or bug in the current implementation. And I would, love to see his innovation to figure out how we undo it or how we back out of it or what's the alternative to it, because he would see it's just as poisonous as anything could be.
Right. Yeah, and I wonder how much of it is a necessary feature. How much of this profit motive needed to be in the system for it to scale the way it is scaled, and for so many people to be able to have access to these platforms. I think you're right. There's a good and evil to this.
Right. I
Absolutely.
mean, the standard defense to the surveillance is at least it's free.
Right.
Well, it's not really free. I mean, because you're paying with data. But it is true that to the extent, we have these amazing services that don't cost anything, they would have cost something.
Right.
But on the other hand, I think if we were subtle about it, we could imagine places where we're less concerned about that infrastructure existing and places where we're more concerned about it existing. So, I frankly don't care that Netflix watches what I watch and then recommends to me new movies to watch. I like that. That's great. It's giving me what I want. It's giving them what they want. You win-win.
Right.
I'm concerned about it when, I see the Facebook news feed of my friend turn him into a crazy person. And it's turning him into a crazy person by design. By design. It's trying to make him as angry and as engaged as it can so that he reveals more and he shares more and he engages more. That's the business model. And when that business model is deployed in the domain of democracy, it's tragic, because what it does is disable us from even understanding important national issues, let alone resolving them. I mean, think about this pandemic. I as you mentioned, I wrote this book, They Don't Represent Us. And part of that, and that book is, the title is ambiguous between they as in the government, and it's also they as in we don't represent us. The way we're represented just is not properly representative of us. And if you had asked me at that time whether I thought, if there was an impeachment of President Trump, there would be a polarized understanding of that event, I would have said yes, of course. That's what politics will do. There'll be the Fox News view and there'll be the MSNBC news view, and never the twain shall meet. But if you then said, well, what about like a global pandemic where 250,000 Americans die, and we shut down the economy and it's devastating to all sorts of people? What about then? Would we have a polarized partisan understanding of that? I would have said no. I would have said that's just a bridge too far. And of course I would have been wrong. And the fact that I'm wrong, terrifies me, because it shows that even with the most important issues, tangible death-causing issues, they can't step back from their underlying drive to turn us into crazy people. They can't even say, okay, we'll just pause. We're not going to play this game. And, it's not like it's unprecedented. Like, if we went to war with a country, there would be this norm that would immediately kick in. Like, we're going to do news different. We're not going to talk about this in a left-right way. We're going to talk about national interest and like, how do we think about uniting the people? That's not capable. We're not capable of that anymore. Like, there's no war. There is no, war with viruses. There's nothing. And that's because, what's striking is news, which used to be a cost center, the sort of public service that broadcasters would provide. Okay, we get all this great profit from I Love Lucy. We ought to pay some of it back by having Walter Cronkite, right? Now it's like the profit center. It's like, this is how we make our money. Cable news, it's like, let's get as many talking heads to scream at each other, and then we'll make tons of money in advertising. And so you're not going to walk them back from that. You're not going to regulate that. You're not going to ban it. And so the question is whether we as a people can rise above it. And it's hard to see how that happens. And God knows, I wish Aaron were here to think, like, what tweak would make it possible for us to get there, because we need that right now.
This is something I struggle with, because I wonder, there was such an optimism in the early days of mass internet, in the late 90s, early 2000s, that everything's going to be open. Everyone's going to be able to express an opinion. We'll be able to share ideas, and the best ideas will rise. And it feels like in the last few years, people have just started to see the toxicity in having everyone on these platforms. And you're almost starting to see a reversion. I have a lot of friends who are stand-up comedians, and a lot of them, they started off by writing jokes on Twitter and sharing things out there as much as they could. and they're now moving towards a more of they're using Patreon and platforms like that and putting things behind a paywall because there was just so much anger and vitriol towards jokes that they were writing. And do you feel like that people are now kind of reverting back into their shells because there's been some sort of failure of this optimism of the internet?
Yeah, but again, I want to insist that we not talk about it as if it's a continuum, right? There was the thing everybody was optimistic about. That's not the thing we have right now. The thing that we have right now is that thing plus the business model of advertising on top of it. So I don't know what the world would look like if we didn't have the business model of advertising on top of it. Remember the early days of AOL where, you paid a monthly fee and you got access to AOL. And AOL had chat rooms and they had, discussion rooms, whatever they were like, groups. You could talk about whatever you wanted. But there was no incentive to turn people into crazy people. There was no monetization of like the extent to which I could tweak you and turn you into a rabid anti-Trumper or a rabid pro-Trumper, right? There was none of that. And so we don't know what the internet that we were trying to celebrate then would have become. And because maybe, part of the reason why so much of this crazy stuff rises to the top is that it pays, right? But if nobody was getting rewarded for sharing it, or nobody was like profiting from like being able to leverage that into better advertising, who knows what it would look like. Right. So I think that's the first point. The second point is, I do think that we were naive when we imagined that, eliminating the so-called censors would automatically produce, truth and knowledge and happiness, right? Because another way of talking about censors is editors. And what editors do is they decide what the appropriate thing is for a public to understand. And there's no neutral decision there. It's not like there's right and wrong. And you can't look on our past and say that, the 3 news channels that were curating the news circa 1972 covered like the right things they should have been covering or covered them completely fairly or there's no golden past. But the point is there was a function and a role that could help us avoid the kind of catastrophes that we see right now. So, if Donald Trump tried to run for president in 1976, right? Nobody would put him on television in 1976 because this is just crazy talk. We're not going to put you on television. But in 2016, they couldn't say no. I mean, if NBC did not cover him 24/7, then people would turn to ABC or to CNN or to, Fox. And so the competition that's been produced in a world where nothing can, there's no editors effectively, means that we're just vulnerable to what, triggers the most passion among us. And we've never had that kind of dynamic driving democratic speech so completely. And, we have to learn to get beyond it. Now, I think they're interesting analogies. Aaron wouldn't have gotten these because he was a terrible eater, but like food. So you think about processed food. Processed food is designed to become addictive. Like the perfect mix of salt, fat, and sugar, like makes it so it kind of hacks your brain. You don't know how to stop. And, many people can't stop. They just sit there and they eat, over and over, and they become incredibly unhealthy because of that. Now, one response to that is a kind of Bloomberg response. Let's let the government regulate food. And, maybe that makes sense. But I think the more sustainable response is for humans to learn how to control what they eat. And like the slow food movement is a really effective way. It says basically, let's observe what we know about human bodies and let's fit our eating to what we know about human bodies. So what we know about human bodies is that if you cook your food, you can't make it as poisonous as processed food is. You just don't have the chemicals. You don't have the ability. So if you cook your food, you're going to eat healthy food. And I'm not saying pre-processed food, I'm just like, take potatoes and take broccoli and take, steak and put that together. That's going to be healthy food. And if you eat with friends, meaning you eat for 2 hours, that'll be healthy for your body. So that's design the food to fit the body. I think there's an equivalent that we need to recognize in the information space, a kind of slow democracy movement, right? And so recognize that Twitter and Facebook are the equivalent of like potato chips and buffalo wings, right? They're just bad for you. You're not going to get any good information about like who you should vote for from Twitter or Facebook. It's not going to work. But there are information platforms like podcasts, which I think do bring people in and give them a chance to reflect in the way that humans can. Narrative is a wonderful way to bring people in and get them to reflect in a way that, this is what we've learned over the last 50,000 years to do. And so you fit knowledge to the nature of the brain and what we know about psychology, and we could begin to educate people in an effective way. Now, I often think about Reddit in this context because it's kind of between the two, right? Because, the reality is I go to Reddit first in the morning. That's the first thing I look at. And then I go to the Times or to even Google News, right? But Reddit is the first thing I look at. That's leveraging something of, the trust of the crowdsourced rating that, moves something up or down. Obviously there's tons of horrible stuff on Reddit, but if you pick your subreddits well, it's really wonderful. Data is beautiful. I think is one of the most extraordinary collections of knowledge that there is out there.
It's a great one.
And so, this is bringing about the right kind of selectivity. Nobody's profiting from shooting craziness to the top. We're just saying what we want. And there's, some effort to begin to reward stuff there that, I think people are worrying about because, it could create exactly the wrong set of incentives. But I think it's an interesting counterexample to the kind of crudeness that Facebook and Twitter have produced. On the other hand, it doesn't really induce people to get deeper into understanding of anything. You read 100 Reddit headlines, right? You don't read 2 articles from the New Yorker. And so it's hard to know what exactly is great or to be worried about. But again, would have been kind of angry that there isn't an errand to engage that conversation.
Right, and even now, even Reddit's now facing criticisms of censorship. They've removed a bunch of subreddits. I think that the biggest pro Donald Trump subreddit was just recently removed. It had close to 1 million people. So it feels like we're trying to strike this balance right now in the internet of letting people say whatever they want to say.
Yeah.
Which I think was kind of Aaron's seemed like very much a free speech absolutist, and now maybe we're trying to bring in the edges a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know where he would sit on this stuff. It is bizarre though to think, for example, the New York Post puts out this completely ridiculous Hunter Biden story, which is so obviously planted just before the election. All these bizarre, weird sources that are relied on, and so they put that out. And Twitter begins to throttle the redistribution of it. Okay, 25 years ago, if you had said there's a crazy story that was published in the National Enquirer, aliens land and they've kidnapped Donald Trump's niece, you wouldn't say the New York Times had to run that story. You wouldn't say there's a violation of the First Amendment that the New York Times did not report that the National Enquirer says that aliens have landed on Earth, right? You would think they have the right to decide, no, this is bullshit, and we're not gonna redistribute this. But now Twitter exercises that judgment, and you have Republican senators calling for an investigation about this election tampering for failure to repeat what they've exercised their judgment to believe should not be repeated. Now, that's crazy talk, right? And if we're getting to a world where there's a right to hijack the conversation by inserting stuff that will just turn us crazy, like catnip in the middle of a political election, then I don't know what we do to kind of restore some kind of sanity to it. But the reality is, these were issues that were not there when Aaron was here, and so I don't know how, in the end, he would have wrestled that issue to the ground.
I wanted to ask you about that New York Post story actually, because I heard the analogy that in that circumstance, Twitter's not so much the New York Times as it is the company that owns the delivery vans that delivers the paper, and that Twitter's acting in this way as if the delivery vans that were delivering the New York Times didn't like an article that was in the Times and then just decided not to deliver the papers.
Well, but the point is, I mean, these analogies are always imperfect.
Right.
The delivery vans are delivering papers that have had an editor oversee them. Like an editor made a judgment whether this article was in the paper or not. And the most important thing that the New York Times editor does is decide what will not be published. And you can criticize them. You can say they censored things by not publishing them. But the point is, a systematic exercise of judgment, according to standards that you can defend, is not censorship in the way in which we were talking about censorship. Yeah, I mean, look at Wikipedia. Wikipedia exercises enormous control over what gets published on Wikipedia. If you don't fit one of the 4 norms, it doesn't get up there. It just doesn't, right? You can't sort of have a vanity entry for like your cat on Wikipedia. Like, it's not going to be up there. And if you put some one-sided story up or one-sided facts up that doesn't have any support to it, it'll be taken down. That's editing, and that's what editors do. They live up to some sort of standard. So when Twitter says, all right, we are like this automatic delivery van, and we have to take responsibility for the consequence of being that automatic delivery van. And so one way we'll take responsibility is at least begin to exercise control when we are confident that there's some flaw or some falsehood at the essence of the story. I don't think that's a problem. I think that's a necessary evolution of these platforms in the digital age. There are no editors, which means we got to figure out what we're going to do to complement the technology to make sure that it doesn't make us vulnerable to this crazy talk.
Yeah. I want to turn to some of Aaron's activism. I wanted to ask you about what he did with the PACER system. And as a lawyer, I've had to deal with the PACER system, and it's basically this government program that takes a bunch of federal court cases, puts them behind a paywall, and you have to pay 10 cents a page to download them. And it's this kind of old archaic system. It looks like it was built in the 80s. It probably was. And so Aaron got in trouble for downloading I think 2.5 million of these old cases and wanting to release them to the public. And his argument was that this is the law. People should be able to access this freely. Were you in touch with Aaron at all during this? Do you know what his thought process was? How he even got this idea to do this?
I don't remember exactly when I became aware that he was doing it, although he had told me about it. It was a classic example of the way Aaron's mind worked. Like, was there a principled justification for the restrictions that were being placed on that distribution? No, there wasn't. There's a bureaucratic justification. And the bureaucratic justification was, here's a good way for us to get money to help us fund the court system. So it was like it was an implicit tax argument. And Aaron thought that was unjustified. And he worked very hard to assure that the way that he would exploit the access was technically legal under the terms of access. So, it wasn't substantively legal in the sense that the law was not trying to enable this, but it was technically legal. So, as Pacer would set up free days in libraries, he would take a machine in there in free days and he would suck everything down. And then the question is, could he republish it? And the answer was, well, what law says he couldn't republish it? So he and Carl Malamud were working hard to protect the privacy interests of people whose information was there. So it wasn't a privacy concern. There was no copyright concern because it's not copyrighted material. There's no trademark or trade secret concern. So the answer is he should be able to publish it. So every step was a logical step in the way a hacker tries to hack around a technical kludge. But the lawyer types were like, yeah, but it's not really what you're supposed to be doing here in that access. And they were trying to leverage that into a criminal case. So the FBI, turned it into a massive investigation. They tried to intimidate him by showing up outside of his house, and he was terrified. He wasn't. I don't think Aaron was brave in the way that Che Guevara would have been brave. I don't think he would have willingly suffered physical deprivation. He wanted to be more clever about it. Like, what can I do to bring about justice? Recognizing that doing it smartly might be able to mean doing it cheaply.
And did that investigation scare him at all? Did he say, maybe I need to back away? And we'll get into the JSTOR event. So obviously he didn't stop altogether.
It scared him in the sense that people said to him, and I think I said to him too, you can't rely on the law doing the right thing. Like, if you have this naive view of the law, which is the law get it right, if you watch law stories on television where in the end it always gets it right, then you're like, okay, I'll fuck around with the law. I mean, it'll get it right. It'll understand in the end I'm a smart, good person and it won't punish me. That's bullshit. Especially criminal law. If you cross over into criminal law land, you are in real trouble. Even if you're innocent, you're in real trouble. And, that's because even if you ultimately prevail, you've prevailed after spending $1 million to defend yourself. And most of the people in that position can't afford $1 million to defend themselves. So they settle for something less than what's being charged because it's the only rational thing for them to do. So the legal system is deeply, deeply broken, especially the criminal law system. And Aaron, I think at the beginning just didn't quite get that, because I think most of the lawyers he knew were kind of smart, decent people. If you kind of hang around the Stanford Law School and you talk to the Stanford law professors, those are good people. You couldn't imagine them ever doing anything mean or evil or insensitive or not sophisticated. But that's not the law. And I think after Pacer, a couple of us tried to read him the Riot Act about that. The issue isn't whether you're right. The issue is whether you survive. And that's not a function of being right. It's a function of a bunch of other accidental things that unfortunately are the definition of what criminal law is.
Right. And I think that would be the counter argument that maybe a prosecutor would have, which is, oh, it's easy to be a good person when you're an academic and you're in your ivory tower. But when we actually have hackers coming in and we have, people who might be doing it for a good cause, we have people who might be doing it for a bad cause, we need to prosecute the law that's on the books.
Well, maybe. But, it's not as if the criminal justice system doesn't exercise discretion in all sorts of ways. And then the question is, well, what's the discretion that you're exercising? So I think in the, kind of my outraged post after Aaron died, I was talking about at the same time that the President of the United States is having dinner with the people who brought about the 2008 financial collapse, people who objectively caused huge harm to many people's lives. Many people committed suicide, many people's lives were destroyed. Those people are having dinner with the president. And yet, the prosecutor in Aaron's case is like, well, we have a duty to enforce the law. And it's like, if there was any doubt about whether Aaron was doing this for bad reasons, if there was some sense that he was going to, take this collection of academic articles and sell them to somebody for $1 billion, I get it, fine. But, it didn't take 10 minutes to understand what was going on. And what was going on was not some sophisticated visa hacking scheme. It was an effort to take stuff that everybody expected should be accessible, especially in the third world, and make it accessible. And so, for them to pretend like they have a duty to enforce the law when, 2 cases later, they're bending over backwards not to enforce the law because it's some rich or connected or likable person on the other end, is not credible.
What's incredible about the JSTOR story is that it seems like there were so many steps along the way that they could have exercised some discretion and realized this isn't a terrorist who's trying to bring down the country. This isn't some awful criminal. And you even had JSTOR saying we don't want to prosecute this. And it seems like it hinged on the fact that they continued with this prosecution hinged on the fact that MIT, which is where Aaron accessed these files, MIT didn't stand up the way JSTOR stood up and said, we don't want to prosecute. Is that the idea that you had, that if MIT had said something, the whole thing would have changed?
Maybe. I think MIT didn't say something because MIT, again, had this, I mean, it was two things. One is many people had this naive view about the law. So their view was, it'll work itself out. Like, they'll figure out. We don't have to do anything. They'll figure it out. It's not for us to do, number one. Number two, MIT understood that this was really important to the government to be prosecuting these cyber crimes. And MIT is very dependent on the government. You know, they get a lot of money from the government. So they don't want to be on the wrong side of the government here. And so I think those two things together, one more noble if ignorant, the other less noble and self-interested, led them to stand back and do nothing. Whereas JSTOR realized that they had no interest in having prosecution here, and they quickly stood up and said they didn't have an interest in prosecution. But, you know, I think the part of the story people don't understand, which is really, I mean, there's so many dimensions of tragedy, some of which we won't discuss, but one dimension of tragedy, which I think we should keep on this at the surface, is that, you know, Aaron was motivated to do this because of a mistake. So, you know, there was this conversation at this conference in Budapest that the Open Society Institute had organized, where the question was raised, what would it cost to liberate JSTOR to the third world? And I can't remember what the number was, but some crazy number was suggested.
I think it was 250 million, if I remember that story right.
Right. And Aaron read that to mean that's what JSTOR would charge to liberate it to the third world. When what was meant was if you had to start from scratch at that moment and engage in the process of building what JSTOR had built, it would cost $250 million. Okay, but based on this assumption that they would charge $250 million, that was like a price they were offering, you know, he felt justified in saying, screw you, that's outrageous. You're taking a bunch of work you didn't even produce and you're going to charge $250 million to make it accessible to the third world? I'm now entitled. I'm now like obligated, if my conception of justice, to try to liberate that stuff. And the tragedy, of course, is that it wasn't $250 billion. I mean, you know, in fact, they were already in the process of figuring out how to negotiate to make this work accessible to everywhere in the third world. And the limitation on them was not their desire to make money. They're a nonprofit. It was that these, you know, many of these journals who ultimately controlled the price at which their material was made accessible were unwilling to allow this third world exception or like developing world's pricing scheme. But they were working very quickly to get to that. And it's, in my view, it's plausible that but for this whole thing happening, you could have seen JSTOR within a couple of years of that conversation doing exactly what Aaron wanted, making this all accessible to the third world for free. So the idea that in the end, everything here turned out to be premised on a mistaken understanding is just ridiculous. It's like, wow. Just somebody had paused and said, wait, what do you mean by that?
Right.
The world would have been a very different place.
Did the FBI or even the Secret Service, I think, was involved as well? Did they speak with you about this? Because I've heard you speak so beautifully and eloquently, and you were so close to Aaron. They didn't speak with you at all.
No, I mean, early on, when Aaron was originally arrested, he came to me and I provided some legal representation to get him to other attorneys so, he could be properly represented in the process. And, he had come to be a fellow at the center I was running at Harvard, and the police came because they wanted to then search his computer at Harvard. And so I engaged just in the sense of enabling, the execution of their warrant. But, they didn't interview me at all about what I knew or what I get, because, Aaron did not tell me this is what he was doing, and he wouldn't have told me this is what he was doing.
Right.
Because he knew I would have said, don't do this. And he wanted to protect me, in some sense, we ask, why was he at MIT given he had an office at Harvard? I think it was because he didn't want to embarrass me at Harvard, who had brought him in and made him a fellow. And so he wasn't interested in, he didn't involve me beforehand. It was afterwards when he sort of acknowledged what exactly had happened. But I think that fact, means that I wouldn't have been much of a witness to the government.
Right, right. Did you try talking to MIT at all? Did you try to make sense of it to them? What
Oh
was their
yeah, yeah.
response to you?
No, we had enormous efforts at MIT. Joey Ito was the most significant actor there, who was trying to get MIT to do the right thing. He was obviously head of the media lab at that point, um, the reality is they're just incredibly recalcitrant. They were not going to move. They were not going to budge. Um, and and again, I don't know if it was evil as much as just ignorance. They just believed it would work out, and they didn't. They certainly didn't believe Aaron was going to do what he did. So, maybe they would have intervened later on if things hadn't worked the way they were supposed to. But it was, tragically stupid that they didn't step in and try to make this thing go away. Because again, what any lawyer should tell you, is if you cross into the criminal law space, you got to get out as quick as possible. This is like, imagine you're surrounded by radiation. You just have to get out. You've got like 2 minutes before it's over. And of course, he was in it forever. So,
do you think part of the zealotry of the prosecution was because at the time they were dealing with the Manning leaks and with WikiLeaks, and that they just wanted to make an example and put a stop to anyone who was hacking into anything, no matter how severe the hack actually was?
yeah, I mean, I think that the Boston U.S. Attorney's Office had a special cybercrime unit, or the FBI, I guess. I can't remember now which of between. But the point is, I think it's the U.S. Attorney's Office has a special unit devoted to cyber crimes. And cyber crimes are difficult to prosecute. It's a unit that was set up originally to stop Russian hackers from stealing people's credit card or like stealing their social security. Like nobody should be ambiguous. There are a lot of people doing really horrible things on the internet, and they should be prosecuted and locked up. I think there's no ambiguity about that. But they're hard to catch because, they're smart and they're not in the United States, and they're practiced in evading detection. So if you set up a department that's supposed to be attacking cybercrime, it's going to be really hard to be successful. And then this whale comes across, the transom. It's trivially easy to prosecute Aaron. He's not going to run away. The facts are pretty clear. You've got the thing on tape of him like placing the stuff inside of the MIT closet. So why not? Like, then you've got a clear win, and you got this clear win. You can celebrate the effectiveness of your office.
Right.
So I think that there's a sense in which, like, it's obvious you're going to pick this as opposed to trying to track down that Russian hacker of somebody's Social Security account, and there it was, plenty of resources to pursue it.
And so they charged him under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and I think he was facing, I think it was 35 years and a $1 million fine and a bunch of other punishments. Did he at the time have any idea? I mean, he knew he was doing something he wasn't supposed to be doing, but do you think, did he have any idea it would have been that severe, the punishment that they would have thrown at him?
No.
Yeah.
I think, he thought he could be slapped and he would recover. But I think there was no sense that, they would take this as a cause célèbre. I mean, you said 35 years. So technically what that refers to is the U.S. attorney has a press conference when they release the indictment, and they say that they're going to try to get 35 years in prison for him. Never in the negotiations was it anything close to really that. But, the negotiations were still huge forfeiture of his independence, his wealth, and a huge and a significant prison term, and the loss of his civil rights. In some sense, I think ultimately he would have been happy to go to jail if he could have kept the right to vote. And I think the idea that he was going to give up his ability to participate politically for something he didn't think was wrong, was just too much. It was like non-negotiable for him, and that left him in the place that he was in, that he was.
And I think they actually offered him a plea agreement. Why did he end up not taking that?
It's that the plea
That
agreement required him
okay,
to admit guilt to a felony. The felony would have disenfranchised
gotcha.
him, and you know, I think that his lawyers in the end were quite convinced that they could beat this, and so they didn't want him to take it. And I think what he was doing in the end, that you know, the depressing sequence that led to his suicide was he was thinking, well, I'm going to have this, you know, year-long fight. I might win or might lose. If I win, I've spent all my money, so now I got to go back to work. I can't be, you know, kind of independent in the way that he had been independent. I mean, he didn't make a ton of money from Reddit, but he was extremely frugal, extremely frugal. And I think he was imagining he could live his whole life on that money, but just doing what he wanted to do, as opposed to being required to go to work for Condé Nast every day. And I think when the image of that freedom was gone, on the assumption that he wins, or gone on the assumption that he loses, but he also has to go to jail and lose the right to participate politically, both of those options just seemed like options he didn't want to live with. And you know, again, it's the deep flaw of our criminal system that you fight to survive only to die because the cost of that fight is so substantial.
I don't know if you're comfortable sharing this, but I don't think I've ever heard you talk about the last conversation you had with Aaron. Do you remember what that conversation, what it was about? Are you comfortable sharing that at all?
No, I remember the conversation. I mean, Aaron was not feeling well. I had reached out to him because we were trying to help him secure the support that he needed to make this financially viable. And he hadn't responded to me, so I reached out to him again, and then finally connected. And he said he had had a cold and he was taking a lot of cold medicine. Um, and then a couple days later, he was dead.
Did you did you see it coming? Was could you tell he was in a depressed state?
Um, no, not a depressed state that would lead to suicide. He was depressed I mean, he was upset that he was in the place
Right,
he was
right.
in, and nobody, you know, there's no doubt anybody would have been there. But you know, I wasn't you know, he was living in New York. I was in Boston. I didn't see him regularly. We spoke a couple times in the weeks leading up to his suicide. Again, to kind of think about how could he support himself. And every time we spoke, he was, you know, he sounded perfectly fine. There was nothing in the way that he spoke or the things he spoke about that led me to think that he would have ever contemplated something like this.
I saw you give a talk shortly after he died, and you were talking about Aaron's Law, which was supposed to be an amendment to the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act that he was charged under. Was there ever any progress made to that? Was that even introduced in Congress? I don't remember hearing
Oh
anything
yeah,
about that beyond your talk.
yeah. No, Zoe Lofgren, who's the congresswoman from Silicon Valley, or one of the two, she introduced the law, and she got some good co-sponsorship, even on the right. And then I think it's I don't want to slander a company. There's a particular company, whether it's Cisco or Hewlett Packard or somebody, who stepped in and said, "This just can't happen. We're just not going to let this happen." So they leveraged their full lobbyist support to block it from being changed. And you know, it was pretty clear that was going to happen, despite it being bipartisan, because obviously, you know, these companies want to preserve the maximum range of threat against anybody who would do anything wrong with their code. Now, it's interesting. Right now, this year, there's a Supreme Court case that will test the scope of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, where you know, a police officer uh, uses his access to the police records to get information about people for totally personal reasons. And so he's charged under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act as exceeding his authorization. And so the court, I think, will have a chance to say that's crazy. And I kind of predict they will. It's a kind of bipartisan thing that I think everybody can agree on. Alex Kaczynski, before he became scandalized over his, alleged sexual harassment issues, had been a huge skeptic of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act because he just thought it, from his perspective, which was, growing up in communist Romania, this just struck of like the worst of the Soviet system. You have everybody as a criminal, and then the government picks which criminals it's going to prosecute. So there's not a single person who hasn't violated the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, period. There isn't a single person living in the modern age who hasn't. So who are we going to prosecute? Well, people we don't like. We're going to prosecute them. And that's got to be wrong. And I think that the court will come around to like seeing and finding a way to say that it's wrong. But obviously 8 years too late.
Yeah. I'm an outsider when it comes to progressive politics, but Aaron's view of politics was something I always respected, that he believed that by getting information out there, by shining a light on corruption, by shining a light on injustices, and by having conversation and discussion and debate, that's how we could bring about change. And I feel like when I talk to especially younger progressives today, that they've sort of lost that view of how to bring about change, and it's more of an authoritarian streak. How much has progressivism suffered, do you think, since the loss of Aaron?
Well, Aaron was successful in bringing about change through massive protests and organizations when Barack Obama was president. So, when Barack Obama was president, so-called progressive at the top, the fact that there were tens of thousands of progressives marching in the street mattered. And it mattered ultimately to the policy decisions that they made and to what Democrats did. So the success on the SOPA-PIPA fight was a success that was possible because they knew they could get a happy audience in the White House, and that trickled down into the rest of Congress, and that eventually led to that victory. And, if you watch his last speech, the last speech he's recorded as giving, talking about that victory, you can see him kind of, feeling, he wasn't somebody who constantly felt like he was a success. In fact, he was deeply skeptical about his influence or success. But you could see him like feeling like that was a success. That was a very important moment of success. But today, in the middle of the Trump administration, people marching in the street has no effect. In fact, it has the counter effect. Like Trump wants liberals to march in the street so that, the Proud Boys can come and trigger some sort of violent reaction. Then he can talk about law and order and people rally around the law and order method. So I get why people don't think peaceful is going to work anymore. But what I think they need to recognize is that just because peaceful won't work right now doesn't mean that violence would. To the contrary, we lose the violence war. Not only do they have more guns, but whenever violence begins to happen, America turns conservative overnight. They turn conservative. This is what Martin Luther King recognized, right? It was only by being the victim of violence that you could ever penetrate the deep racism of most of America, especially American South. Like you had to find a way to trigger empathy. And that was not by expressing strength through violence in a kind of Malcolm X-like way. It was through being an unjust victim of violence. And not like he would sacrifice his people. It's not like the Edmund Pettus Bridge was a plan. But he knew that, in a Gandhi-like way, being committed to peaceful, nonviolent protest would eventually get him on the right side of history in the minds of most people. And I still think that's true. If there's no way anybody would convince me that we're at a place where what we have to do is to take up arms and take over the government. We'll see after this election, but not right now.
And I've heard you talk about how Aaron really helped move you to become more active in politics and even really shift your entire academic focus. What was it about Aaron that pushed you to get more involved and to make that change?
Well, there was a very specific conversation. At the end of December 2006, I was at the American Academy in Berlin. Aaron came to attend the CCC conference, an annual conference in Berlin of the Chaos Computer Club. And Aaron came to see me, and we sat down to have a long talk that evening. And I was excited to share with him what would become my last book, which was on copyright, which was Remix, and talk to him about this first TED thing I was going to do later on that year, in the new year. And, he was not impressed with either of them. And at certain points, I've told this a million times, he said to me, why do you think you're ever going to make any progress on these issues so long as we have this deeply corrupted political system? And I said, it's just not my field. And he said, you mean as an academic? I said, yeah, as an academic, it's not my field. I do copyright internet policy. He said, well, what about as a citizen? Is it your field as a citizen? And, I was incredibly vulnerable to him because I wanted to be the person he believed I was. I wanted to be the person who acted on the basis of principle and what was right, cost be damned. And so part of me was like, yeah, I ought to do this. And the other part of me was like, what are you talking about? Like, you're like the preeminent policy person on this issue. Nobody else has the influence that you do. And you could spend the next 20 years talking about this issue and, giving talks, making $10,000 a talk. Like, this is your path. Like, just stay on the course. But thinking about it like that made me immediately think I've got to do what Aaron would do. So I did what Aaron would do. And I told him that night I was going to give up copyright and internet policy, and we were going to take up this fight against corruption. He promised in San Francisco that following fall we would start an organization which became Root Strikers that would begin that work. And that summer I announced at the iCommons event, which is the event for Creative Commons people and everything like that, that I was finished, that I was not going to work in this anymore. There's a very particular moment. And in a certain sense, when he died, and, suicide has a blast radius, so I was clearly within the blast radius. And, feeling extraordinary guilt about not helping my friend through what was obviously a much more significant moment of depression than anybody had perceived. All of that translated into me thinking, well, this is the only thing left. I've just got to make this work. And, at every stage, there's been like the crazy thing to do. And I feel like I've grabbed the crazy thing to do. I feel like I've leapt off of tall buildings repeatedly. Because in some sense it is so urgent and it is so true and necessary, and we'll see how many times I can leap. We'll just leap until I can't leap anymore. And it's because in a sense I think I owe it to him. And part of me says, fuck you to him.
Why is that?
Yeah, because he started me on this, promising he would be with me on this. And he let this, this whole fight about access to these journals was a side issue for him. It wasn't the most important issue. So, it's almost like I feel like he was wasting himself, in that fight. I understood he had to make the fight. I understood, it became, but if he had been a little bit more disciplined about what he was going to work on and like stay focused on this and stay committed to this, and if in the last days before he died, if he had said, I don't think I'm going to get through this, then the enormous suffering that so many people have borne because of it would not have been there. And so, I love him as if he were my son. I love him. I've dedicated so much of my energy to like carrying out what he told me to do. But as with your son, I'm angry too, because I feel like it didn't have to be like this. And then to discover it was all based on a mistake, just a misunderstanding.
Well, Professor Lessig, I appreciate everything you're doing. I appreciate you carrying on Aaron's legacy. Your work is incredibly meaningful. And Aaron, he left a beautiful legacy. In the short time he was here, he accomplished more than most of us could ask for in 100 lifetimes. And so I appreciate you being willing to talk to me and being so open. What can people do, if people who want to continue carrying on Aaron's legacy? Where would you direct them?
Well, look, Aaron began as a computer geek. He ended as a political activist because Aaron believed, as he told me, nothing can happen until we fix this democracy. There was a brief moment when he thought Barack Obama was going to fix everything. So after he started me on the corruption project, he then left and took up Demand Progress, which he thought was going to push Barack into being the progressive great white hope, and I remember teasing him about that when he did it, because I was like, you told me nothing is possible till we fix this, and Barack Obama's passing Obamacare is not going to fix it. So I think if you want to do something about his legacy, act on the truth which he uttered. We got to fix this democracy. We got to make a representative democracy work. Because if we can't do that, then nothing matters. Internet issues don't matter. Healthcare doesn't matter. None of these things are going to get addressed in a serious, sensible way. That was his truth, and it's still true.
Professor Lawrence Lessig, I know you're extremely busy. I greatly appreciate your time speaking with me. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks.